a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, the 18th of October 1744, rose to be one of the most influential women of her time through her close friendship with Anne, Queen of Great Britain. Sarah's friendship and influence with Princess Anne were widely known, and leading public figures often turned their attentions to her in the hope that she would influence Anne to comply with requests. As a result, by the time Anne became queen, Sarah's knowledge of government and intimacy with the Queen had made her a powerful friend and a dangerous enemy. Sarah enjoyed a long and devoted relationship with her husband of more than 40 years, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough. She acted as Anne's agent after Anne's father, James II, was deposed during the Glorious Revolution, and she promoted her interests during the rule of James's successors, William III and Mary II. When Anne came to the throne after William's death in 1702, the Duke of Marlborough, together with Sidney Godolphin, the first Earl of Godolphin, rose to head the government, partly owing to his wife's friendship with the Queen. While the Duke was out of the country commanding troops in the War of the Spanish Succession, Sarah kept him informed of court intrigue, while he sent her requests and political advice, which she would then convey to the Queen. Sarah tirelessly campaigned on behalf of the Whigs, while also devoting much of her time to building projects such as Blenheim Palace. Sarah, a strong-willed woman, strained her relationship with the Queen whenever she disagreed with the Queen on political, court, or church appointments. After her final break with Anne in 1711, Sarah and her husband were dismissed from the court, but she had her revenge under the Hanoverians following Anne's death. She had famous subsequent disagreements with many important people, including her daughter, the 2nd Duchess of Marlborough, the architect of Blenheim Palace, John Vanbrugh, Prime Minister Robert Walpole, King George II, and his wife, Queen Caroline. The money she inherited from the Marlborough Trust left her one of the richest women in Europe. She died in 1744, aged 84. Early life. Sarah Jennings was born on the 5th of June 1660, probably at Holywell House, St Albans, Hertfordshire. She was the daughter of Richard Jennings, a Member of Parliament, and Frances Thornhurst. Her paternal grandfather was Sir John Jennings, father, by his wife Alice Spencer, of an extraordinarily large family. Her uncle was a prominent naturalist. Richard Jennings came into contact with James, Duke of York, in 1663, during negotiations for the recovery of an estate in Kent that had been the property of his mother-in-law, Susan Lister. James's first impressions were favourable, and in 1664 Sarah's sister, Frances, was appointed maid of honour to the Duchess of York, Anne Hyde. Although James forced Frances to give up the post, because of her marriage to a Catholic, James did not forget the family. In 1673, Sarah entered court as maid of honour to James's second wife, Mary of Modena. Sarah became close to the young Princess Anne in about 1675, and the friendship grew stronger as the two grew older. In late 1675, when she was still only 15, she met John Churchill, 10 years her senior, who fell in love with her. Churchill, who had previously been a lover of Charles II's mistress, Barbara Palmer, Duchess of Cleveland, had little to offer financially, as his estates were deeply in debt. Sarah had a rival for Churchill in Catherine Sedley, a wealthy mistress of James II and the choice of Churchill's father, Sir Winston Churchill, who was anxious to restore the family's fortune. John may have hoped to take Sarah as a mistress in place of the Duchess of Cleveland, who had recently departed for France. But surviving letters from Sarah to John show her unwillingness to assume that role. Marriage. In 1677, Sarah's brother Earl died, and she and her sister, Frances, became co-heirs of the Jennings estates in Hertfordshire and Kent. John chose Sarah over Catherine Sedley, but both John's and Sarah's families disapproved of the match, therefore they married secretly in the winter of 1677-78. John and Sarah were both Protestants in a predominantly Catholic court, a circumstance that would influence their political allegiances. Although no date was recorded, the marriage was announced only to the Duchess of York and a small circle of friends, so that Sarah could keep her court position as maid of honor. When Sarah became pregnant, her marriage was announced publicly, and she retired from the court to give birth to her first child, Harriet, who died in infancy. When the Duke of York went into self-imposed exile to Scotland as a result of the furore surrounding the Popish plot, John and Sarah accompanied him. And Charles II rewarded John's loyalty by creating him Baron Churchill of Weymouth in Scotland, Sarah thus becoming Lady Churchill. The Duke of York returned to England after the religious tension had eased, and Sarah was appointed a Lady of the Bedchamber to Anne after the latter's marriage in 1683. Reign of James II, 1685–1688. The early reign of James II was relatively successful. It was not expected that a Catholic king could assert control in a fiercely Protestant, anti-Catholic country. In addition, his daughter and heir was a Protestant. However, when James attempted to reform the national religion, popular discontent against him and his government became widespread. The level of alarm increased when Queen Mary gave birth to a Roman Catholic son and heir, Prince James Francis Edward, on 10 June 1688. A group of politicians known as the Immortal Seven invited Prince William of Orange, husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade England and remove James from power, though the plan became public knowledge very quickly. James still retained some influence, and he ordered that both Lady Churchill and Princess Anne be placed under house arrest at Anne's residence in the Palace of Whitehall. Both their husbands, though previously loyal to James, had switched their allegiances to William of Orange. Sarah, however, describes in her memoirs how the two easily escaped and fled to Nottingham. Although Sarah implied that she had encouraged the escape for the safety of Princess Anne, it is more likely that she was protecting herself and her husband. If James succeeded in defeating Prince William of Orange in battle, he might imprison and even execute Lord and Lady Churchill for treason, whereas it was unlikely he would condemn his daughter to a similar fate. But James fled to France in December 1688 rather than confront the invading army, allowing William to take over his throne. William III and Mary II. Life for Sarah during the reign of William and Mary was difficult. Although the new king and queen had awarded Sarah's husband the title Earl of Marlborough, Sarah and John enjoyed considerably less favour than they had during the reign of James II. The new Earl of Marlborough had supported the now exiled James, and by this time Sarah's influence on Anne and her cultivation of high members of the government to promote Anne's interests was widely known. Mary II responded to this by demanding that Anne dismiss Sarah. However, Anne refused. This created a rift between Mary and Anne that never healed. Other problems also emerged. In 1689, Anne's supporters demanded that she be granted a parliamentary annuity of £50,000, a sum that would end her dependence on William and Mary. Sarah was seen as the driving force behind this bill, creating further ill feeling towards her at court. William responded to the demand by offering the same sum from the privy purse, to keep Anne dependent on his generosity. However, Anne, through Sarah, refused, pointing out that a parliamentary grant would be more secure than charity from the privy purse. Eventually Anne received the grant from Parliament, and felt she owed this to Sarah's efforts. Sarah's success as a leader of the opposition only intensified the Queen's animosity towards the Marlboroughs. Although she could not dismiss Sarah from Anne's service, Mary responded by evicting Sarah from her court lodgings at the Palace of Whitehall. Anne responded by leaving the court as well, and she went to stay with their friends Charles Seymour, the 6th Duke of Somerset, and Elizabeth, the Duchess of Somerset at Syon House. Anne continued to defy the Queen's demand for Sarah's dismissal, even though an incriminating document signed by the Earl of Marlborough supporting the recently exiled James II and his supporters had been discovered. This document is likely to have been forged by Robert Young, a known forger and disciple of Titus Oates. Oates was famous for stirring a strongly anti-Catholic atmosphere in England between 1679 and the early 1680s. The Earl was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The loneliness Sarah suffered during these events drew her and Anne closer together. Following the death of Mary II from smallpox in 1694, William III restored Anne's honours, as she was now next in line to the throne, and provided her with apartments at St James's Palace. He also restored the Earl of Marlborough to all his offices and honours, and exonerated him from any past accusations. However, fearing Sarah's powerful influence, William kept Anne out of government affairs, and he did not make her regent in his absences, though she was now his heir apparent. Power behind the throne, Queen Anne. In 1702, King William III died, and Anne became queen. Anne immediately offered John Churchill a dukedom, which Sarah initially refused. Sarah was concerned that a dukedom would strain the family's finances. A ducal family at the time was expected to show off its rank through lavish entertainments. Anne countered by offering the Marlboroughs a pension of £5,000 a year, for life, from Parliament, as well as an extra £2,000 a year from the Privy Purse, and they accepted the dukedom. Sarah was promptly created Mistress of the Robes, Groom of the Stole, Keeper of the Privy Purse, and Ranger of Windsor Great Park. The Duke accepted the Order of the Garter, as well as the office of Captain General of the Army. During much of Anne's reign, the Duke of Marlborough was abroad fighting the War of the Spanish Succession, while Sarah remained in England. Despite being the most powerful woman in England besides the Queen, she appeared at court only rarely, preferring to oversee the construction of her new estate, Woodstock Manor, a gift from Queen Anne after the Duke's victory at the Battle of Blenheim. Nevertheless, Anne sent her news of political developments in letters and consulted Sarah's advice in most matters. Sarah was famous for telling the Queen exactly what she thought, and did not offer her flattery. Anne and Sarah had invented peat names for themselves during their youths, which they continued to use after Anne became Queen: Mrs. Freeman and Mrs. Morley. Effectively a business manager, Sarah had control over the Queen's position, from her finances to people admitted to the royal presence. Wavering influence. Anne, however, expected kindness and compassion from her closest friend. Sarah was not forthcoming in this regard and frequently overpowered and dominated Anne. One major political disagreement occurred when Sarah insisted that her son-in-law, Charles Spencer, the third Earl of Sunderland, be admitted into the Privy Council. Sarah aligned herself more strongly with the Whigs, who supported the Duke of Marlborough in the war, and the Whigs hoped to utilise Sarah's position as royal favourite. Anne refused to appoint Sunderland. She disliked the radical Whigs, whom she saw as a threat to her royal prerogative. Sarah used her close friendship with the Earl of Godolphin, whom Anne trusted, to eventually secure such appointments, but continued to lobby Anne herself. She sent Whig reading materials to Anne in an attempt to win her over to her own preferred political party. In 1704, Anne confided to Lord Godolphin that she did not think she and Sarah could ever be true friends again. Clash of personalities. Sarah's frankness and indifference for rank, so admired by Anne earlier in their friendship, was now seen to be intrusive. Sarah had a powerful intimacy with the two most powerful men in the country, Marlborough and Godolphin. Godolphin, though a great friend of Sarah's, had even considered refusing high office after Anne's accession, preferring to live quietly and away from the political side of Sarah, who was a powerful and intelligent woman he considered bossy, interfering, and presuming to tell him what to do when Marlborough was away. Sarah, although a woman in a man's world of national and international politics, was always ready to give her advice, express her opinions, antagonize with outspoken censure, and insist on having her say on every possible occasion. However, she had a charm and vivaciousness which was admired by many, and she could easily delight those she met with her wit. Anne's apparent withdrawal of genuine affection occurred for a number of reasons. She was frustrated by Sarah's long absences from court, and despite numerous letters from Anne to Sarah on this subject, Sarah rarely attended, and wrote her excuses and letters to Anne. There was also a political difference between them. Anne was a Tory, and Sarah was a Whig. Sarah did not share Anne's deep interest in religion, a subject she rarely mentioned, although at their last fraught interview she did warn Anne that she risked God's vengeance for her unreasoning cruelty to Sarah. The Queen did not want this difference to come between them. But Sarah, always thinking of her husband, wanted Anne to give more support to the Whigs, which she was not prepared to do. Sarah was called to Cambridge in 1703, where her only surviving son, John, Marquess of Blandford, was taken ill with smallpox. The Duke of Marlborough was recalled from the war and was at his bedside when he died on the 20th of February 1703. Sarah was heartbroken over the loss of her son and became reclusive for a period, expressing her grief by closing herself off from Anne, and either not answering her letters or doing so in a cold and formal manner. However, Sarah did not allow Anne to shut her out when Anne suffered bereavement. After the death of Anne's husband, Prince George of Denmark in 1708, Sarah arrived, uninvited, at Kensington Palace to find Anne with the prince's body. She pressed the heartbroken Queen to move from Kensington to St James's Palace in London, which Anne bluntly refused, and instead commanded Sarah to call Abigail Masham to attend her. Aware that Abigail was gaining more influence with Anne, Sarah disobeyed her, and instead scolded her for grieving over Prince George's death. Although Anne eventually submitted and allowed herself to be taken to St James's Palace, Sarah's insensitivity greatly offended her and added to the already significant strain on the relationship. Abigail Masham, political rival. Sarah had previously introduced her impoverished cousin, then known as Abigail Hill, to court, with the intention of finding a role for her. Abigail, the eldest daughter of Sarah's aunt, Elizabeth Hill, was working as a servant to Sir John Rivers of Kent when Sarah first learned of her existence. Because Sarah's grandfather, Sir John Jennings, had fathered 22 children, she had a multitude of cousins, and did not know them all. Out of kindness and a sense of family solidarity, she gave Abigail employment within her own household at St Albans, and after a tenure of satisfactory service, Abigail was made a Lady of the Bedchamber to Queen Anne in 1704. Sarah later claimed in her memoirs that she had raised Abigail, in all regards as a sister, though there were implications that she only assisted her cousin out of embarrassment of her difficult circumstances. Abigail was also a second cousin, on her father's side of the family, to the Tory leader Robert Harley, later First Earl of Oxford and Mortimer. Flattering, subtle and retiring, Abigail was the complete opposite of Sarah, who was dominating, blunt and scathing. During Sarah's frequent absences from court, Abigail and Anne grew close. Not only was Abigail happy to give the Queen the kindness and compassion that Anne had longed for from Sarah, she also never pressured the Queen about politics. Anne responded with pathos to Abigail's flattery and charm. She was present at Abigail's secret wedding, in 1707, to Samuel Masham, groom of the bedchamber to Prince George, without Sarah's knowledge. Sarah was completely oblivious to any friendship between Anne and Abigail, and was therefore surprised when she discovered that Abigail frequently saw the Queen in private. Sarah found out about Abigail's marriage several months after it had occurred, and immediately went to see Anne, with the intention of informing her of the event. It was at that interview that Anne let slip that she had begged Abigail to tell Sarah of the marriage, and Sarah became suspicious about what had really happened. After questioning servants and the royal household for a week about Abigail's marriage, Sarah discovered that Anne had been present, and had given Abigail a dowry of £2,000 from the privy purse. That proved to Sarah that Anne was duplicitous. Despite being keeper of the privy purse, Sarah had been unaware of any such payment. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to